you everyone for joining. It's our pleasure to be here as part of the Barcelona Health Innovation Week. Um, we are bringing to you some content that I think will be very interesting for you, whether you are at this point thinking about planning clinical studies because you want your device to get to the market, or whether you're maybe already in the post-market stage and thinking about post-market clinical follow-up studies. So when we think about clinical studies for medical technologies, for medical devices, we often focus mostly on safety and on performance. But many of these technologies that meet those requirements, we notice that often they still struggle to achieve actually this broad adoption in practice to get the device actually on the market and be used by patients. So today, we just want to look on what happens there, how we can make sure that early study design choices can influence not just approval, but actual real world implementation and can support value discussions. So thank you so much for joining, and we will dive right into it. So the agenda for today, we have a few speakers here. We have Rob, we have Ian. So we will do a quick introduction of who they are, the companies that they are coming from. Then we want to hear from you. As I alluded to already, we want this very much to be a conversation. We want you to be able to speak up, to ask your questions. And we also want to hear a little bit more about you. So we will do a quick poll on yourself and what your current knowledge is, let's say, on the topic. Then we will dive into the core problem that I already briefed a little bit. Okay, it's not just safety and performance, but we might have to look a little bit further to make sure that bringing our device to the market is actually feasible and it's actually a commercial success. We'll have a case study because I think it is always better to see things really from a practical point of view. So it helps you to understand and to really capture the information we're giving to you. And then last but not least, we'll give you some tips about how you can actually design your clinical study to set it up for commercial success. And of course, we'll have some time for Q&A as well. So before we go into that, a webinar would not be a webinar or a successful webinar without some housekeeping rules. So the webinar will be recorded, so just be aware of that. The presentation will also be made available after the webinar, so you will be able to get the slides as well for your reference. As I mentioned, we have a dedicated Q&A at the end of the session, but I'm fully aware that you can see some of the content passing by and you might have some ad hoc questions. So two options. You can put your question into the chat if you like, or you can raise your hand and then we can unmute you and we can just have the conversation at the time point that is relevant for you. So don't be shy. We are very happy to speak to you. So either into the chat of the Teams meeting that we're having, or you can just raise your hand and we can unmute you. First of all, who we are. So brief introduction into the speakers of today. And I would first like to give it to my dear colleague, Rob Bedford, who is the CEO of Franklin Health.
Thank you, Lara. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Rob Bedford. I'm the CEO and Head of Clinical Operations at Franklin Health. I'm very excited by this opportunity to chat to you today about the importance of commercial and clinical mindset, because I think very often as innovators, we become so focused on what we perceive as the biggest regulatory approvals as being the biggest piece of work. So everyone is focused on getting CE marking or FDA approval, and that becomes your North Star, when actually that's only the very beginning. Once you've got your regulatory approval, you then need to get hospitals, doctors, buyers to purchase your product. You need to get adoption, you need to think about reimbursement, and that actually can be a much bigger uphill battle than the clinical study. So what we're trying to do today is to hope that innovators think about these commercial questions very, very early on in the development process. So don't be, the regulatory part is very important, but the sooner you can start thinking about the commercial viability of your product and what questions you're asking and what will be give you the best success for adoption, then you're going to be setting yourselves up not just for regulatory success, but for commercial success. So thank you all for joining and looking forward to the discussion.
So mute myself. Thank you so much, Rob. So I've been speaking already a little bit. Within Franklin Health, I am the director of regulatory and startup. So anything that is related to the startup of clinical studies that is within my field of expertise. Today, I will not be speaking too much on the topic. I'll leave it to the experts, Rob and Ian. But I'm here as well in case there is anything particular you would like to ask me. Then I will hand it over to Ian, who is joining as a CEO of MediLife.
Thank you, Laura. Hello, everyone, and just echo Rob's words. Thanks to everybody for joining, and I hope this is a useful session and an interactive one. I think that would make for a good webinar certainly from my perspective. So my background very much commercial, pharmaceuticals, and then into MedTech. And typically, as Rob's highlighted, when we're looking at a commercial side of new startups with new innovations, we often see, FDA approvals, we see EU MDR, we see UK conformity assessments, and all of those kind of boxes being ticked. And then the real world starts to come into play, where you start talking to clinicians and payers, and the people will physically be using the innovation day to day. And I think that's where we then see some challenges around data, and often the need to start looking at gathering more data. So hopefully through what we discussed today, you'll see some tips, some considerations that you may want to build in upfront in the design of your study to help capture some data that supports the commercial argument out the other end, and ultimately enables you to commercialize your product a little bit quicker. And with lower cost. So that's the goal. Hopefully we can get there.
Thank you, Ian. So as you might have noticed, we have speakers from both companies, which is, I think, the uniqueness of this webinar is that we can really look into it from the point of view of a market access specialist, which is MediLife, represented by Ian here, but also from the really practical point of view of how you will actually make sure that you design your studies properly, from a CRO point of view, represented by Rob and by Franklin Health. So we'll just briefly give you a little introduction into both of the companies, so you know where we're situated, what kind of questions you can direct to whom, and then we can take it from there. So first of all, let's dive a little bit into Franklin Health. Rob, if you want to take that away.
Thank you, Laura. So Franklin Health, we are fundamentally a contract research organisation. Our expertise is clinical operations. We are MedTech only, so we only work with diagnostics and device manufacturers. And further, we only really work with small and mid-size organizations because we understand the unique challenges that small and mid-size organizations have that perhaps larger organizations don't have. So we specifically created our company and structured our company to work with the small and mid-size innovators who are perhaps driven by investment milestones and have lower budgets and need the flexibility when delivering clinical studies. So our expertise is MedTech, health tech, and diagnostics. And we work with companies globally. So we have run clinical studies in US, APAC, EU, UK, and other regions. And we have achieved regulatory approvals for PMA, de novo, CE marking. So we have a global expertise. Our HQ is in Leeds in the UK, but we do have small offices in Denmark and in Spain. And as I said, our core expertise is clinical operations, so the design and execution. We do also have some regulatory partners that we work with. And now one of the things that we want to do that's slightly different is have this bigger picture approach, because our goal is not to deliver a clinical study and get the clinical study report written and then move on. Our goal, our objective is to get your medical technology to market, to patients, into the hands of doctors. And to do that, you need to be thinking about the commercial viability of your product and how you're going to sell this and the countries in which you're going to launch. So that's why we've partnered with MediLife, so we can have this bigger picture approach for our clients, and together we'll set them up for commercial and regulatory success.
Thank you, Rob. Ian, a little introduction from MediLife.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rob. So yeah, I mean, fundamentally, the aim of MediLife, which was set up around 10 years ago now, was to enable patients access to innovative medical technology. And I mean, I think it's fair to say that every healthcare environment, no matter what region you're in, is complex, just with different layers of complexity. So we support companies navigating various different healthcare markets from similar to Rob, I guess, APAC through Europe into the US. And the US seems to be quite a target audience for a lot of the companies that we work with currently. We also work very closely with companies at the stage where they need funding. So we're working alongside VCs and alongside MedTech at an early stage to look at strategy and engagement with venture capital in order to fund getting the business off the ground ultimately. And obviously clinical trials forms a big part of the initial budget in doing that. Post study, once you've got your data and you've got your approvals, we then support companies to physically start up in country. So we have kind of an in-country side to the business where we help with launch strategy. In certain cases, we can put sales and marketing teams on the ground, or we can distribute the products. We have offices in the UK, that's where most of the team are based, and a small office in Germany. So that's just a little bit about us. And then in terms of some of the partners and the variety, you'll see from some of the list of names, you might recognise some of them. There's actually a mix of pharmaceutical through to medical devices and AI. So we've kind of covered a broad spectrum. And my background initially was 15 years in senior leadership roles within pharmaceuticals before setting up MediLife in 2016 and predominantly working in the med device and AI kind of software side now.
Thank you very much, Ian. So we heard a little bit about MediLife, a little bit about Franklin Health, and our two speakers of today. I think it's time to just hear a little bit more about you. We would be happy to learn, for example, where you're from. So you should normally be seeing a poll from Mentimeter on your screen. So have a go at it, and you can submit in the right hand of your screen where you're actually based. I see most of people are in Spain, which makes total sense, of course, as we are in part of the Barcelona Health Innovation Week. I see also some presence here from the US, also from Africa, Nordics, which might be someone from Franklin Health. That's wonderful. I'm so happy to see that there are people joining from different parts of the world, which is, I think, very good for this webinar because it's a topic that is not specifically linked only to the EU. All the content that we will be sharing is perfectly applicable in all parts of the world and perfectly relevant. So that's wonderful to see. So we have another question for you. This is kind of a test to see what your knowledge might already be at this point. So if you wouldn't mind, please let us know what you think are the most important objectives of a medical device clinical study. You should be able to see the options on the right hand of your screen. And let's see what the result is. Most of you are saying, of course, effectiveness and safety, which are without doubt very important objectives. And I would say probably indeed the most important ones of a medical device clinical study. I do see also someone voting for usability, which is actually wonderful as well, because this is just what we want to talk about in this webinar. So we all know actually that showing that your device is effective, showing the clinical benefits, showing the safety of your device is one of the main objectives of your medical device clinical study. But there were some other things that from the top of your head you might not be thinking about that could also be relevant to include, to explore into your study. And that kind of brings us to the next question. So other than safety and effectiveness, what other kind of considerations do you think hospitals use when they adopt new technology? So what if you would be, let's say, a hospital, if you would be a decision maker and you would be thinking, I would love to implement this new technology that I'm seeing here, but no, what is your but? What would you also be thinking about if you're saying, I know it's safe, I know it's effective? What else would be important for you? Data privacy, reimbursement, if it fits into the patient pathway and into the care environment, also very important. Security, workforce needs, cost, again, scalability, it's also a very good one. The current systems that are being used, yes, definitely. Privacy. As they're coming in, Ian, Rob, would you like to touch base on any of these?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's a good list of other considerations. I think leads nicely into why we're having this webinar in terms of how do you, through the design of your study, build in some endpoints, not necessarily primary endpoints where we're looking at potentially safety and efficacy, but how do we build in some endpoints and some data capture touch points that start talking to some of these points that you've made here? Because ultimately, unless you're an academic institution, the requirement on your clinical study partly is regulation, but predominantly is to drive your commercial success in the future. And I think that's where, hopefully, through some of the conversations that we'll have and some of the information we'll share, some of these can be, and Rob can allude how, but we can weave some of these endpoints into the study design up front. And I think that's the crucial bit, to think of these things and build it in early so that you maximize your commercial gain at the other end.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Ian. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. We have quite a good of points that we will be touching on in a bit as well. So why don't we just dive right into it? So we have been talking a little bit about safety and effectiveness is important, but what else? No, what else is out there? We'll just have Ian talk a little bit about that.
Perfect. Thank you, Laura. So I think if we look at the journey that typically medtech companies would go through, in fact, anyone launching a new innovation, and the start of that starts with a huge cost. So probably one of, if not the most expensive single investment that a company will make is in the pivotal study. So typically we would see in a medtech environment, maybe between 5 to 15 million pounds that's spent. And the crucial bit is to make sure that 18 months post-approval, once you've gone through your study, and typically studies take, as we all would, I think, recognise longer than we would like, you don't want to find out that you've missed some crucial data, so that your data doesn't talk to, for instance, in a UK environment, a NICE submission, or in the US, CMS are asking questions that the study doesn't particularly answer, or hospitals won't buy your product at the other end because you didn't capture anything that related to workflow, or the study just doesn't talk to workflow. So I guess the key, and all of those points that were made earlier, is the marginal cost in the scheme of things of adding some additional data fields, quality of life questionnaires, for instance, is quite trivial in the grand scheme of cost. But the opportunity cost of not having included those data and capture points is huge. So
I'm going to try and guess what he was going to say there. Treat your study as an opportunity to collect as much data as possible to set yourself up for not only regulatory success, but also commercial success. I think we also have Alistair on the call from Medilife.
Yeah, perfect. Let's see if we can get Ian back in 30 seconds. It's the problem with living out in Norwich. I'm sure with middle of nowhere, no internet. And I think the key thing that we see in Medilife is some of these challenges come from not properly thinking through your journey, but focusing on the milestones ahead of you, such as regulatory approval. But that's only one stage, and actually it's not really the commercial goal. We're all not in this just to get a nice CE mark or MDR. We're in this to make sure that this lands in the hands of patients. And to do that, we all know there's quite a big journey to go through in terms of influencing clinicians that your tool or device is useful, giving the people who control the budgets an idea on cost effectiveness, and making sure that patients understand the benefits in some particular cases. What we see is missing in some of these clinical studies is in particular targeting the wrong populations, going for targets that are actually never the intended commercial use, making sure that you're not integrating into workflow the number of clinical studies designs that we see that perhaps treat the device as a secondary tool and don't look at time saved. Clinical input is a really key indicator of what's missing here. And I suppose the key challenge with this, when you think about it, is clinical studies are done for a reason, to prove effectiveness and get their MDR. But as Ian was saying, there's a great opportunity to collect this data to really accelerate adoption. But that doesn't come without challenge. Rob and I will know that there's probably a challenge between the CRO side of what they can actually measure without increasing the commercial budgets, and actually making sure that we're focused on those primary endpoints and secondary endpoints. And that's where you need or in our opinion, you need a commercial team that is working hand in hand with your CRO and clinical research team, so they can have that argument for you and make sure the study is designed effectively. Is it all right to have next slide, please? I'm not sure I'm in control.
Yeah, no, I can move to the next one.
Perfect. So this is a really common problem, right? We've seen this time and time and again in terms of companies coming through, getting a study, getting regulatory approval, particularly internationally, landing in Europe, and they come to us with a query of, why am I not selling? I've been approved, I have this trial data, but why is it not moving forward? And this is really a great example of the core problem, which can be a delay in reimbursement cycles. You've missed some key data that a procurement team asked for through you could have collected in your clinical study, but actually you're now going to have to repeat a real world or post-market study to collect that data. You potentially missed a competitive disadvantage, so being able to compare to a competitor, you missed that in your study. And this all leads to more time to market, more time to commercialization, and in essence, greater cost. If we're too narrow in our subgroups, when we're looking at that population, we can actually reduce our market. Having a CE mark or a regulatory approval in a particular population could actually restrict the market that you're able to access. Or it could act as an early adopter. It could accelerate the targets that you're getting to. And this really leads to a longer sales cycle. What we see time and time and again, particularly from those international clients, is coming to us with that problem. I thought I had the regulatory approval to sell, but it's just not landing. Why am I not getting traction? And that really is shown in the longer sales cycles and that length in reimbursement. I can see Ian's rejoined, so I'll let him come back in on the back of that.
Yeah, I do apologise. My Mac seems to have just frozen and force quit, so I'm not sure what what Alistair then covered.
We've just covered the final slide, Ian, and we're talking through these bullet points at a very high level.
Sure. Okay. So I'm sure Alistair covered all of the pertinent points in terms of your endpoints, your strategies, and making sure you're kind of covering all of the boxes. I guess just to re-emphasize, setting the commercial mindset at the very start before you get involved in your study design and your protocol will ensure that you can reduce some of these longer sales cycles at the other end, and also reduce the amount of further investment that you need to make in follow-up studies, whether that be from a health economics perspective, workflow design, and how you physically integrate your technology into a system, a healthcare system. And I think that's true, and that applies whether you're looking at US, whether you're looking at European markets or the UK.
We will also go into the case study because I think from now you've seen how important it is to think early about any kind of additional endpoints that you could add that sets you up more for this commercial success. So these numbers, which are honestly sometimes, for me at least, a little bit frightening to see how many delays there can be, for example, to avoid all of this. Now, the point is, this looks like perfect, let's try to avoid it, but how are we actually going to do that in practice? Which is the whole reason why we have a case study for you, so we can kind of walk you through a case that actually happened and what we would have advised in that specific case and what could potentially be done a little differently to make sure it's set up more for commercial success. So Ian, let's talk a bit about a case study for breast biopsy devices, if you wouldn't mind giving us some background on that.
Yeah, no, for sure. So, well, I think as everybody will acknowledge, breast cancer, one of the leading causes of fatalities, deaths, and for women. globally, and there's some new advances in technology. I mean, this is very sort of basic in an example in terms of breast biopsy devices, and I guess a shift towards some of the newer devices, not in reality that new, but thought we'd keep it into a real example of vacuum assisted biopsies, typically higher cost, requiring some capex up front for a physical machine, not disposable. Globally, the market's growing, so it looks like a great place to kind of have a technology launched. But I guess in terms of any new technology, when you're launching, and it depends on the sophistication of the market you're launching into, sometimes the reimbursement is unclear. New approaches, often you need the clinical engagement, but the payers are lagging behind in terms of reimbursements and codes, and therefore availability to use your technology once you have the regulatory landscape covered. If you just click again, please, Laura. Thank you. So as I kind of touched on, expensive, you need to develop your return on investment, your pathway needs to be clear. And I guess deciding on where you want to play, that's kind of a crucial factor in where you design and deliver any kind of clinical research and study, and how you build it back into your pathways. And again, please, Laura. Yeah. So I think overall, when you start to break down, and we try and genericize it as well as look at a specific example. But for this, if you're looking at designing the niche, so where exactly are you going to position your product? Are you going to go in this example as a first-line biopsy device? Are you going to look at high risk? Are you going to try and position it against some other procedure, maybe surgery? Are you going to position it in terms of a screening program? Is it going to be part of something that happens in a screening setup, like the NHS breast screening service? So consider where you want to play, what pathway you want to integrate your technology into, and look at the comparators that the payers are going to recognize. So really choosing the competition that you want to compare against is going to be quite crucial. So do you want to compare against open surgery? Is your technology really going to compete with open surgery, or is it going to be a very niche area that your technology is going to compete into? And then looking at the clinical performance of your, and this is something that obviously came out at the very start, it's very important that your product is efficacious and it actually works. But you'd want to make sure that your trial proves that you don't miss cancers, clearly super important in this environment, but also that it doesn't create a lot of extra work. So how does it fit into the actual practical side in a clinical setting? I think there's some of the kind of crucial stages to consider when you're looking at, in this example, a breast cancer device. And if you just click through again, please, Lara. And I guess that all leads into, making sure you're gathering the right evidence up front, but then the economics of how your technology is going to be used. So building a study to show the total pathway cost, for instance, not just device cost. And I think this sometimes gets missed when you look at kind of pricing. Typically, how does our device compare to another device, rather than what's the actual implication of utilizing the device in practice? What's the total cost to the system? So having maybe a little bit more of a broader view. What does the kit cost clearly comes into it, but procurement time, what staff can operate the equipment, recovery time, any complications, how many surgeries would you avoid? All of these things kind of build an economic picture. And you should also consider looking at quality of life. You know that certainly some health technology appraisers will look at cost per quality and quality data, certainly in terms of NICE in the UK, that's a big one. So do you save money, or are you equivalent or are you going to increase costs? That's going to determine the commercial success at the other end. And then there's some other sort of maybe softer, as we might describe them, factors. So patient experience, what's the patient journey and how's the patient reacting to this new technology? And we've certainly seen it with some novel imaging technologies that we've represented in the past that, being, how do I say this in a good way for a healthcare system, being better for the patient doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get anywhere in terms of a payer and an adoption environment. You'll definitely get clinical support, you'll definitely get some patient support for your innovation. But actually, and we've heard this said, certainly in the UK, that the NHS particularly won't pay for convenience or for patient benefit necessarily if it's not clinical and if it's not efficiency or cost saving. So I think cost and efficiency play a huge role in making sure that your technology will be adopted further down the line. And then I guess in terms of reimbursement and kind of go-to-market enablers, designing your data and your capture so that it fits into codes and tariffs. Some really good examples slightly outside of this in terms of we worked with a lung cancer screening AI software, for example. Now, trying to launch that in Germany up until recently would have been a very challenging situation because it wasn't reimbursed. So I think making sure that you understand the market from a commercial point of view, from an adoption point of view, making sure that your technology will fit into some reimbursement codes and some tariffs is crucial. Making sure you've got data that captures and can answer some of those questions for the payers so that you don't have to revisit data collection in order to build up a good health economic argument for your technology. Hopefully that kind of broadly covers in terms of this biopsy device. I think, Rob, you can go into a bit more detail in terms of the study itself and what sort of things you should start to capture.
Sure, thank you, Ian. So I hope what you've understood from Ian there is that there's many, many more factors to consider other than safety, effectiveness, clinical benefit. And of course, they are the most important objectives and endpoints you need to include, because when you're submitting to a notified body, they will say, demonstrate the clinical benefit of this, demonstrate it's effective, and demonstrate it's safe in your patient population per the intended use. So you should start with those as your primary and secondary objectives, but then you do have scope to include some exploratory endpoints. And when you're designing the clinical study, this is the opportunity for you to collect the data, which will allow you to achieve some of those commercial successes that Ian spoke of. Now, the challenge is balancing this, because in a perfect world, everyone would have millions and millions and millions of euros or pounds and then include loads of exploratory endpoints, and you'd have an entire arsenal of data ready for use depending on whatever country you were targeting. But this is not realistic. Clinical studies are extremely expensive. Every additional endpoint you include requires perhaps more patients, a bigger N number, and more work for the sites, and then ultimately more costs. So I hope what we're trying to get across here is when you're starting to think about your pathway to market, the first thing you need to do is understand exactly who you're going to be selling to, who's going to be using your device, how your technology is used in hospitals, what the barriers are to adoption, and that's where you start with your exploratory endpoints. So in more often cases than not, you're going to be up against another technology. So you have a new development in technology and you want to say your technology is better, is cheaper, easier to use. So you can think about a comparator design. So you want to show either superiority or non-inferiority to other devices on the market, and that will allow you to show clinical and economic benefit. So you can think about perhaps timing beds. So as we all know, in the NHS and other healthcare systems across the world, there's a shortage of beds. Hospital beds are very expensive. So if you can show your technology reduces the amount of days that patients spend in hospitals, hospitals see that as a cost reduction. If your technology allows fewer antibiotics to be administered, or more pain relief, less pain relief, these are all cost savings for a hospital. And these are things that you can easily collect. And you can show that your technology has fewer beds, antibiotics, pain relief, for example, than the comparator. So when you're then coming to sell your product to hospitals, you'll be equipped with that data. So think about how you can use your exploratory endpoints with the comparator study. So not only safety, effectiveness, and clinical benefit, but some of the other aspects as well. So then, relatedly, the economic and resource drivers. Healthcare systems are overwhelmed. We live in an aging population. Patients are spending increasing amounts of time in hospitals, and budgets are constrained. So you need to show that your technology is going to either make cost savings or cost efficiencies somewhere. So for example, in the breast biopsy device case here, you want to know how much room utilization, for example, is going to be taken up. Are you going to be making savings for the number of hours of rooms utilized, or how long does this procedure take? If a procedure is quicker, then the doctor can do more procedures per day. That's cost savings. Consumables, lots of NHS trusts and healthcare systems are working towards more sustainable technology. So if you have lots of single-use plastic, these are factors to consider. Staffing, if you can reduce the amount of staff involved in a procedure, and then also learning curve. This is a big one. So if you have an extremely complicated technology which requires weeks and weeks of training, and there's a learning curve, so perhaps the operator is not as good at the beginning and it takes a while for them to get used to the technology, this will also be a barrier to adoption. And so you need to show that your technology it can be quickly adopted, and you can give an example of an exploratory endpoint, and you can say our surgeons can learn very quickly on this technology. These are all examples. Real world use. So what you want to do is show in your clinical study that the technology can be used in a real world setting. A clinical study by itself is a very controlled environment, and it has to be, because that's how the experimental design works, and you show statistical significance. But you can also implement some real world conditions. So you could perhaps in your clinical study show that your device is able to be used by different types of operators in different settings with different mixes of patients. And so when you go to sell this product to the hospitals, you can say, we have the clinical data to say that this technology can be used by a wide variety of users. It's easy to use, and it can be used across a different range of environments. And then the downstream clinical impact. So this is related to the safety and effectiveness. You want to go slightly beyond the safety and effectiveness and show that the clinical impact of your technology is high. So do patients need to come back in for another biopsy? How was the sample rate equivalent? Surgical biopsy conversion, time to definitive diagnosis. These are just some other parallel exploratory endpoints that you could include in your clinical study. So hopefully once you've done your clinical study, you've got the safety, performance, and then you've got all these other exploratory pieces of data that will allow you to have the commercial success that you need.
Thank you so much, Rob. So we dived a little bit into the specific case of breast biopsy devices, touching base on how you can actually make sure that you have some exploratory endpoints that can help you and set you up for commercial success. I feel like I'm broken records here a little bit, but okay, that do help you to make sure that you don't need to think about it later on and create delays. But of course, the points that we were touching base on here are points that apply for many different kind of technologies. So Ian, if you wouldn't mind maybe going through a little bit the takeaway message that we really want to bring across here.
Yeah, I think certainly in terms of making sure that you're covering, early in the thought process for your clinical study design, the payer side, who's going to physically pay for this technology. once we've got approval. Making sure that as a result of that, you're matching the populations that you're looking to cover. And I think more broadly, where do you want to launch? So I don't think there's a universally a right first market to try and launch in, but there's definitely a wrong sequence for your device, whatever that device might be. So as an example, if you want to get maybe some fast revenues at the end of your study, and you've got some strong clinical data, then Germany might be a great place through the NUB pathway. You can get some reimbursement fairly quickly through that pathway with certain technologies. If you're looking at sort of quite capital intensive or need volume, then clearly the US, huge market. So we see a lot of companies want to go to the US because of that. If you're looking in terms of an innovation that can save a system some money, then you definitely know that the UK is a good environment, and NICE would like to talk to you about saving some money. So I think the key bit is understand your markets, understand globally the markets, and choose where to go first. Engage in that market with the payers, the people that will physically buy your technology at the other end, and then making sure that you're ticking off and capturing as much data up front as you can do. That kind of is the crucial bit. So in terms of the data, I mean, we put in here wrong endpoints. I think it's a case of clearly safety efficacy is your primary endpoint. You need to prove safety. You need to prove that your technology is going to work. But then it's all of the other things that Rob described. They're the things that may make a difference. So plan your pivotal study, if you like, is a kind of chapter one, but it's not the complete story. It's not the complete book, and it's certainly not the complete end goal. So plan the evidence journey, if we describe in that way, beyond just approval. Make sure that you've got some data that matches with national registries wherever you're trying to launch, and make sure that you can transition that into some long-term data capture. So try and, if you can as well, link it to things like NHS Digital, US claims databases, EU health records. All of those things, if you can start to build that in early, will help you in the long term. And some of the subgroup analysis and things that would then talk to expanding your label once you've got approval. So do you want to consider going into an elderly population or high-risk population, or for some specific indications beyond the initial approval? So I think all of those things kind of go into the mix. I mean, Lara, if you want to just extend it to the rest, because it's kind of talking more broadly, I guess. And I think the other thing to just touch on is that certainly from a payer environment and also from a regulatory perspective, there's an expectation of ongoing real world evidence to be gathered, and we see that across the board. So building that infrastructure in your study earlier is way cheaper than having to go back later and kind of try to retrofit it or gather additional data in more studies. So I think, consider the environment, consider the markets, look at the way that your clinicians are going to adopt your product, and try and build as many of, I think we're repeating ourselves over and over, but try and build as much as you can and think through the complete journey into commercialization as early as possible, and build in what you can early. That will save you time, and it will save you a huge amount of money.
Thank you, Ian. Rob.
So I think we'll just conclude that you cannot go back to your clinical study and add in additional endpoints or additional data capture requirements. So the good news is that we're all here today and we're chatting about the importance of thinking early. So it's not too late. The evidence gaps are preventable, they're not inevitable. So long as you're thinking about your end user, the adoption of your technology, the markets which you're going to launch in first, and all the nuances and idiosyncrasies of each of those countries, then you will be fine. These gaps are preventable. So working with organizations such as Franklin Health and MediLife will mean that you get this joined up approach where we don't only think about the regulatory success, but also the commercial traction as well. So you want to design studies that say, will this improve outcomes and save money in my system with my patients using my workflows? And if you take that approach, then everything will be great. So thank you everyone for listening. I think we're almost at the end there now.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone. I have been looking at the chat and I have not seen any questions coming in. Seems like it's all very clear to you, though I know it's also an extremely large topic. So I would officially like to open a little Q&A. So you will be seeing on your screen Mentimeter as well, in which you can ask your question. We have about 9 minutes of time. So just go ahead, ask any question you may have. As much as you may think, oh, maybe it's a silly question, it really is not. If it's on your mind, then it's on many people's mind. So feel free to ask away. We have a first question coming in. Ian, why is Germany a desirable country to launch in?
Good question. I think the answer to that is it depends on your technology, whether it's desirable or not. In terms of market size, obviously and we certainly speak to companies who want to launch in Europe, in the EU. I mean, if you're looking at initial launch countries, you would definitely say Germany is a big market. It's an advanced healthcare market. But I guess fundamentally it does depend on your technology. If 3 years ago you were trying to launch lung cancer detection AI software, then Germany wouldn't necessarily be the place to go because you wouldn't have had reimbursement. So I think, again, it's a case of if you've got a technology, looking at the various markets globally, deciding on your broad strategy. Are you looking at FDA? Are you looking at EU? Are you looking at APAC? UK would class necessarily within EU. And where does it fit in? So desirable country in terms of market size and healthcare in general in terms of its structure, but really depends on your product. Does that answer that question? I don't know who mentioned that question.
Yes, feel free as well if you would like to just speak up to raise your hand and we can unmute you. Anything else that may be unclear for you? Any question, or would you like to discuss your specific case? Tanya.
Tanya.
Charlie, if you wouldn't mind. Yes, perfect. Hello, Tanya.
Hi, am I unmuted?
Yeah. You're unmuted, yeah.
Super. So I have just 2 questions, I suppose. The first one is, what about if your comparator is the current standard of care, status quo, and funding is a real challenge? So basically, doing nothing costs nothing. And I know that sounds not ideal for patient outcomes, but I'm sure you've come across this many times. How do you really design a trial that is powered to show the true value? I suppose maybe in a software setting. I'm sorry to make it a bit customized here, but what's your experience with something like that?
Sorry, Tanya, did you say it's in the software setting?
Yeah, like I would say in change management. So really in the area of digital health. So doing nothing is standard of care today. It costs nothing and no funding is available.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, somewhere you have to create a value proposition. I mean, I guess, typically companies would, and the clinical study is going to be ultimately the data that your study kicks out is going to be your commercial value proposition further down the line. So without knowing the specifics, and happy to pick up offline with specifics, but I guess you still somehow need to compare to, doing nothing. Is that the most effective thing to do? Does your technology, if it's a workflow tool, does that somewhere in the system save some time? I mean, and I say that it needs to consider the system as a whole, and I use that word deliberately because we often see that you could introduce a new technology, and for one specific part of a pathway or a journey, you will save some money. But actually, all you've done is push the problem somewhere else, either, upstream or downstream. So I think it's important to consider the total system view. But in terms of the physical design of your study, you really need to make sure that you've mapped the system. That would be the start point, end to end as best you can. Look at the inactivity. If it is that nothing happens currently and you've got a novel game-changing technology, and trying to pick some value in your product and what it would do to the end user, to the system. Does it save money? Ultimately, I think if you've got a system that doesn't save money, you're going to have to try to, or does nothing and therefore no cost. Ideally, you'd need to find something that saved some kind of resource somewhere in the chain or physical value.
Yeah, no, I love what you said about looking, across the whole workflow, not just the part of your product. So I think that's really important. And the other thing that I loved, I never thought about before, was the operator variability analysis. So in my previous roles, like we have looked at, particularly in AI software, experienced users versus junior users, and trying to, narrow down the variability there. But I never thought before, which I'm going to think about strongly after, is we always focus on the end user, the physician, and time saved clinically. But actually, we're making lots of workforce generalities across nursing, across patient admission, administration. And I never thought until today that really needs to be studied. And it hasn't really been studied in the trials that I've been involved with in the past. We always have focused on the clinician, and maybe that's very short-sighted.
I think it's common, but I would agree. Yeah, you definitely need to have a slightly broader viewpoint when you're thinking about the commercialization. For sure, you may satisfy a clinical need, but again, that's quite a siloed view. And if you end up pushing a problem somewhere else, you're still not going to get through the payer. So I think, you need to consider the operational impact of your technology as well as just the clinical impact to the clinician that's going to be using your device or technology.
Brilliant. Thank you. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Okay, I see we are right on time. What is just left for me is to tell you, have a think about this, about all the information that we gave you, about thinking maybe a little bit beyond just that effectiveness and that safety when you're designing your clinical study. We are here to help you if you have any questions. Both Ian from MediLife and Rob from Franklin Health, we do some clinical consultations as well, or consultations just in general. Just feel free to reach out with any specific question that you may have. You can see on the screen the email addresses, the LinkedIn pages, and of course at the company website as well. Again, we're here to help you. Just any kind of question you may have, feel free to reach out. Anything from you, Ian, Rob, you wanted to mention before we close off?
No, just to say thank you everyone for joining. I hope you found it very useful. It was a pleasure to discuss with you all today. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'd just echo those words and apologies for cutting out for a big section. Thank you to Alistair for stepping in.
Thank you so much for attending, and enjoy the rest of the Barcelona Health Innovation Week. Take care.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you, everybody.
Bye.